Hi, I'm Andrew Francis, and today we're going to be looking at Isaiah chapter 33. I'll begin by reading for you Isaiah 33 verses 1 to 6. Ah, you destroyer, who yourself have not been destroyed, you traitor, whom none has betrayed, whom you have ceased to destroy, when you have ceased to destroy, you will be destroyed, and when you have finished betraying, they will betray you. O Lord, be gracious to us, we wait for you. Be our arm every morning, our salvation in the time of trouble. At the tumultuous noise peoples flee. When you lift yourself up, nations are scattered, and your spoil is gathered as a caterpillar gathers. As locusts leap, it is leapt upon. The Lord is exalted, for he dwells on high. He will fill Zion with justice and righteousness, and he will be the stability of your times. Abundance of salvation, wisdom and knowledge. The fear of the Lord is Zion's treasure. Now, whilst there are two main interpretations regarding the purpose of this passage, one describing the destruction of Assyria and the other pointing to a future time when evil and the forces of wickedness will be destroyed, as we see described in the book of Revelation. I think it's helpful to keep both interpretations in mind, as is often the case in Isaiah and in other prophetic writings. Whilst there is normally an immediate situation in mind that the prophet is talking about, nonetheless, we can also find application in our present situation and circumstances. And of course, ultimately, we all look forward to the time of God's ultimate deliverance of his people and the creation itself from Satan and all that's opposed to God. And so in its original context, we can see Judah's leaders realizing that all their efforts to free themselves from Assyrian power failed. Egypt has been defeated, and Sennacherib is unwilling to be paid off to leave Judah alone. Hezekiah leads Judah in repentance, and Isaiah gives God's response in this chapter. And so in verse 1, the situation with Assyria is described well. Assyria, in her own records that we can look back on now, sees herself as a destroyer against which no one can stand. Likewise, as a nation, she has no problem in breaking her agreements with other nations, with little fear of reprisal. Judah had made an agreement with Assyria, and now they are doing what they did with others, and Assyria is choosing to overlook any guarantees or promises they might have made with Judah. So Isaiah promises that Assyria will suffer the same fate that she's inflicted on others. She will be destroyed and she will be betrayed. In verse 2, it would seem that God's people have finally accepted the message of God's ways and have decided that their only hope is to wait on him. The very thing that thus far they've refused to do, they now do, and now they look to God alone to save them by his strength and power. In verses 3 and 4, God is roused and makes himself known. At the revealing of God, the nations are scattered before him, and in their haste to escape, they leave behind all their spoil to be gathered, presumably by God's people. And so we read in 2 Kings 19, verse 35 to 37. And that night the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when people arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies. Then Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went home and lived at Nineveh. And as he was worshipping in the house of Nisroch his god, Adrammelech and Sherezer his sons struck him down with the sword and escaped into the land of Ararat, and Esarhaddon his son reigned in his place. And so we can see in this record in 2 Kings that Sennacherib himself was destroyed and he was betrayed by his own sons. The betrayer was betrayed, the destroyer is destroyed. In verses 5 to 6, we are told that God will be the only one exalted. All human powers will be shown for what they are. They'll be reduced to dust, but God will be lifted up. It's only in God that justice and righteousness can be found, and it's only in God that stability, salvation, wisdom and knowledge can be acquired. In Psalm 14 verse 1a, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. In Proverbs 9:10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. And whilst I probably don't need to re-emphasize this, nonetheless, this understanding of God alone being the source of wisdom, knowledge, stability, salvation, must permeate our understanding of how we as Christians deal with and face the world. Often it seems to me that we Christians can be just as guilty as the people of Judah in trying to find peace, security, wisdom and knowledge in the usual ways and offered by the world. As someone who loves reading and studying, and who recognizes the good human knowledge and wisdom can bring, I also recognize that such knowledge and wisdom can never truly give us what God alone can give, and that sometimes such knowledge and wisdom causes us to trust in ourselves and our own understanding rather than looking to God for his word and his way. Again from Proverbs 3 verse 5, we read, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. John Oswalt writes, if there is to be stability, deliverance and true understanding, It will have to come from one who is not himself contingent on the passing world. No one else can even say what is right, let alone establish it. But the person who is willing to admit that his or her destiny is in another's hand, the practical meaning of the fear of the Lord, can experience all these, for he or she is then in touch with the source of all that is. And so we continue reading from Isaiah chapter 33, verses 7 to 16. Behold, their heroes cry in the streets, the envoys of peace weep bitterly. The highways lie waste, the traveller ceases. Covenants are broken, cities are despised, there is no regard for man. The land mourns and languishes, Lebanon is confounded and withers away. Sharon is like a desert, and Bashan and Carmel shake off their leaves. Now I will arise, says the Lord. Now I will lift myself up. Now I will be exalted. You conceive chaff, you give birth to stubble, your breath is a fire that will consume you, and the peoples will be as if burned to lime, like thorns cut down that are burned in the fire. Hear you who are far off what I have done, and you who are near acknowledge my might. The sinners in Zion are afraid, trembling has seized the godless. Who among us can dwell with the consuming fire? Who among us can dwell with everlasting burnings? He who walks righteously and speaks uprightly, who despises the gain of oppressions, who shakes his hands lest they hold a bribe, who stops his ears from hearing of bloodshed, and shuts his eyes from looking on evil. He will dwell on the heights. His place of defence will be the fortresses of rocks. His bread will be given him. His water will be sure. In the next verses, Isaiah expands further on what he has prophesied already in verses 1 to 6. In verses 7 to 9, the situation that Judah finds itself is described by the prophet. The situation is hopeless. Judah's heroes can offer no hope, and the ambassadors have returned with no resolution offered. It's probably similar to the peace talks taking place between Russia and Ukraine. The Ukrainian negotiators must feel similarly. The Russians are unwilling to offer any compromise, and even when the ceasefires are agreed upon to allow civilians a safe way out of besieged cities, the ceasefires are broken, and the civilians find themselves being fired upon. As verse 8 tells us, covenants are broken, cities are despised, there is no regard for man. The land itself groans under the attacks. But not all is lost, as verse 10 tells us. For those who wait on the Lord, there will come a now time, when God will arise and will lift himself up and be exalted. As we pointed out last week in Isaiah 32, at the time when all seems hopeless, and when there can be no help found from human sources, then God turns up. As Oswald describes, human failure is divine opportunity. When God reveals himself, the enemies of God will be destroyed. Even the weapons of the enemy will be used against them. Your breath is a fire that will consume you, says Isaiah. The destruction of Judah's enemies will be so complete that it will be limestone reduced by dust to dust by fire, or thorns consumed in a fire. Things that seemed so difficult and painful previously will now be like nothing after God is finished. In verses 13 to 14, whilst the whole earth will eventually acknowledge the majesty and glory of God, first of all, those who are near will finally acknowledge his might, and those who have failed to truly acknowledge God amongst his own people will realize their sinfulness and godlessness. The fear of God will fall upon them, and as was evident so many times in the Old Testament, the fire of God's presence will produce great fear within his own people. As Hebrews chapter 12 verse 29 declares, our God is a consuming fire. Exodus chapter 20 verses 18 to 20 says this, now when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning, and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled. And they stood far off and said to Moses, you speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die. Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. I think sadly, many Christians are a little bit like the people. We're not like Moses, and I think we should be more like Moses. We don't really want to get too close to God because deep inside we're afraid of God. We realize our God is a consuming fire. And yet because of Jesus, we should have confidence to come right into the Holy of Holies and talk to our Father to get to know him. And yes, allow the fire of his purification to change us and to transform us. Isaiah also describes those amongst God's people who will not be moved at the revealing of the Lord. There are those that will be moved and afraid, because they haven't been living very good lives. But there are the ones who have been living honourably and exhibiting the character of God, the ones who have remained faithful even in the midst of great difficulties. Such people will be secure no matter what takes place, and they will never lack the provision of God. And so we continue to read from verses 17 to 24. Your eyes will behold the King and its beauty. They will see a land that stretches afar. Your heart will muse on the terror. Where is he who counted? Where is he who weighed the tribute? Where is he who counted the towers? You will see no more the insolent people, the people of an obscure speech that you cannot comprehend, stammering in a tongue that you cannot understand. Behold Zion, the city of our appointed feast. Your eyes will see Jerusalem, an untroubled habitation, an immovable tent, whose stakes will never be plucked up, nor will any of its cords be broken. But there the Lord in majesty will be for us, a place of broad rivers and streams, where no galley with oars can go, nor a majestic ship can pass. For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king, he will save us. Your cords hang loose, they cannot hold the mast firm in its place, or keep the sail spread out. Then prey and spoil in abundance will be divided. Even the lame will take the prey, and no inhabitant will say, I am sick. The people who dwell there will be forgiven their iniquity. And so at last the eyes of God's people will behold their true king. As we will see in verse 22, this king is none other than God himself. Even the land that is spoken of is a land that goes beyond seeing, a land that can't be seen from afar. And so in Psalm 45 verse 1 to 9 we have another description of this king. My heart overflows with a pleasing theme. I address my verses to the king. My tongue is like the pen of a ready scribe. You are the most handsome of the sons of men. Grace is poured upon your lips. Therefore God has blessed you forever. Gird your sword on your thigh, O mighty one, in your splendor and majesty. In your majesty ride out victoriously for the cause of truth and meekness and righteousness. Let your right hand teach you awesome deeds. Your arrows are sharp in the heart of the king's enemies. The peoples fall under you. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of uprightness. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. Your robes are all fragrant with myrrh and aloes and cassia. From ivory palaces stringed instruments make you glad. Daughters of kings are among your ladies of honor. At your right hand stands the queen in gold of Ophir. In verses 18 to 19, the prophet describes the people remembering the difficult days from which they've now been delivered. No longer will they need the scribes to determine the amount of tribute, maybe tied to the number of towers that Isaiah mentions. No longer will they be oppressed by people whose language they struggle to understand. Instead, as in verses 20 to 21, Zion will finally be an untroubled city whose tent will no longer be moved. Zion, the place where the presence of God is celebrated in his feast, will now have God living amongst his people in his holy city. Potentially the reference to tents is referring back to the tent of the tabernacle, which moved from place to place along with the people. Now at last God has made Jerusalem his place of permanent dwelling, and no longer will the tent of his presence need to move again. It will be secured permanently. Verse 21 is a little bit difficult to understand. Possibly it's suggesting that Jerusalem doesn't need any rivers or waterways to protect it from invasion, as some of the cities of their foes were used to. The reality was that it was sometimes possible to use the rivers and waterways to gain access to such cities through ships and boats. God is Jerusalem's protection and will be like a river that cannot be forded even by ships and boats. This reminds me of Psalm 46 verses 4 to 7. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Selah. So in verse 22, the climax of the passage is found because all that Judah now has is because God is her judge, her lawgiver and her king. Because God is in the midst of her and God is good and righteous, no longer will Judah need to be afraid. No longer will she be oppressed from within by corrupt leaders or from without by oppressing armies. Verse 23 seems to be a little bit out of context or a bit strange here, and there's been a lot of argument about its meaning and who it's referring to. John Oswald argues that Isaiah is now explaining the present reality of the people. He has just given them the hope of what will be, but at the present the nation remains like a ship going nowhere. It's only when the deeper issue of sin is dealt with that God can finally bring the healing that Judah longs for. As John Oswald explains concerning these last two verses, it makes the point that Judah's need is deeper than the need for deliverance from oppression. Ultimately, says Isaiah, our problem is a broken relationship with God because of sin. That being so, mere defeat of enemies and restoration to the land will not do. The final goal is a forgiven people living a life in keeping with God's character. And I think this final point is a good one to remember. It is one of the problems of teachings that focus too much on prosperity and healing. Whilst I've little doubt that God often heals his people and he blesses them in many different ways, sometimes he does bless them materially, sometimes he blesses us with poverty. Nonetheless, the gospel is not the offer of a better life in this world, but of a restored life in the world to come. The gospel offers us forgiveness of sin and all that separates us from our Father. It offers us a removal of shame and the wiping away of our past. It offers us eternity in perfect peace with our God and the sort of security that we humans can only ever dream of, but which can never be found on this present earth. We don't offer people a better life, we offer people Jesus, in whom true life can be found. His life is available even when the whole world continues to shake and our circumstances are completely out of control. In him alone we have hope. Without him we remain hopeless and subject to the vagaries of a fallen creation and sinful people.